In the early decades of 20th century, while India was striving for Purna Swaraj, Assam and Eastern Province was endeavoring to imagine her place within the idea of independent India. Assam posed a pertinent philosophical question in relation to India's heterogeneous culture. The opening quote by one of the leading intellect of Assam, Gyananath Bora, asked, "Was it necessary for India to get united to attain Swaraj? How would the diverse cultures that took form over thousands of years unite by losing their independent identity?" While Mahatma Gandhi, denoting Swaraj as self-rule, believed that deals of Swaraj could be achieved in modern times only in a united Indian nation or Praja, Bora questioned its basic premise. Bora's juxtaposition had a larger historical context. Assam had been overwhelmed with the issue of migration, provincial reorganization, and imposition of Bengali language in Assam under British colonial rule shaped the Assamese nationality question. Assamese people developed a genuine sense of otherness towards the Bengali speakers. If the trading communities in Marwaris, had controlled the market, the skilled cultivators from East Bengal had influenced the agrarian relations. For Assamese-speaking people, foreigners were the migrants from other parts of India, and the notion of right was articulated around resources like land. Though the skilled Bengali-speaking migrant cultivators became keen contenders of the Assamese peasants, it was the Assamese educated class who extensively wrote about the hardship borne by the indigenous peasants and drifted an idea of Ahomia who belonged to Assam. This primarily shaped the idea of membership in Assam. This would set Assam in a unique position from where it would offer a distinct critique to the forming idea of federal structure for independent India. What marked significance were the unique positioning of the foreigners denoted idea of membership, question of rights over resources, and question of safeguarding the culture. The milieu offers us the primary argument for this paper as it intends to elaborate on how the process of defining her membership, Assam had offered an independent model for India's federal structure much before it was defined in Indian constitution, and how drawing from these definitions after independence, Assam exhibited a unique critique to India's federal structure through her long bargain concerning crucial issues like citizenship. Imagining Assam in India. Idea of membership. I'm referring here to vernacular texts. The first one is Gyananath Bora's Ahmad Bidehi, a collection of essays published in 1925, where he defined a foreigner, a Bidehi. And according to him, all the foreigners were included when we refer to Bidehi. The European tea planters, Kea, which means the Marwari businessmen, Bengali, Hindustani, and Deswali, which means those who speak Hindi and dialects of Hindi, Nepali, and Maimansinghs, the migrants from Maimansingh district. He further divided the Bidehi into two categories: those who were doing harm to the local economy by extracting directly from the Assamese people, and those who were not harmful. According to him, though the European planters were extracting a huge amount of money through the tea trade, they were not harmful to the local economy, as they were extracting from the soil of Assam but not from the Assamese people. But other foreigners were controlling the local economy and directly affecting the Assamese people. He also differentiated between poor Bidehi, who settled in Assam for their need, and rich and educated Bidehi businessmen. He hoped that though the first category of people were creating trouble in parts of Assam by migrating in thousands of number, they would gradually adopt the language and culture of Assam and get assimilated. But the rich and educated class would not. Therefore, there was an urgent need to handle this class in a different manner. For him, it was a national duty of the natives of Assam to take control of the local economy from this class. And he offered a conceptual framework of non-cooperation to boycott these rich Videhi businessmen and help each other to do business. He believed that by building a revolution parallel to the struggle of independence, Assam would prosper, and that was integral to attain Swaraj in India. Bora's primary apprehension about rich, educated capitalist Videhi was due to the fact that they would not adopt Assamese language and culture and would exploit the local economy. Evidently, the idea of membership in Assam was forming around the question of language under the patronage of educated class. Drawing very similarly, like Warren Lee's The Citizen of India, which conceptualized citizenship in India's heterogeneous setup from body politic, Bora argued that provinces were like the parts of the body India. If one part, which is a province, was hurt, then the entire body, which is India, would get wounded. And likewise, if one part was weak, then the entire body would also become weak. Therefore, for him, the prosperity of Assam was a priority. So moving to the second text, that is by Ambika Giri Rai Chaudhuri, which offers towards a legal membership, proposal towards a legal membership. Much later in 1940s, after arrival of Government of India Act 1935, Ambika Giri Rai Chaudhuri, who formed Ahomia Hongrakini Sabha to safeguard the Assamese culture, proposed a design of a federal structure titled Panchayat Rashtra Gothonar Prathamik Asani, preliminary plan for creation of a Panchayat Rashtra, and proposed for a federal nation with autonomous states based on Gandhi's idea of Panchayat. A follower of Gandhi, Roy Chaudhuri believed in Swaraj and articulated it in an Indian federal structure with sufficient autonomy to the federal units. He believed that by achieving unity of different villages in Panchayat Rashtra, the great Indian nationality would form in India, and identically, the great Assamese nationality would form in Assam. Charting out different aspects of Panchayat Rashtra, he prepared a detailed design categorizing rules, election procedure, and the rules for creation of Panchayat Rashtra. Roy Chaudhuri offered that the units of autonomous primary Panchayat Rashtra would be formed on the basis of historical notion of jati, meaning the nation, based on language and culture and territory of these units would be defined accordingly. He also offered that he also offered that the original inhabitants of autonomous subunit would have freedom of right on their language, culture, economy, and polity. This was in the response of emerging Bengali boys who campaigned for equal rights of the Bengali-speaking people for domicile in Assam and for socio-economic and political participation. Undoubtedly, it was through the vernacular writings that shaped Assam's imagination of a people nation as articulated by Partha Chatterjee. It is important to take a note here that it was Assamese-speaking educated, middle class, that played a very crucial role. It is difficult, however, to say for how far the Assamese people perceived these notions. Certainly, it did not reflect in the political choice of people of Assam as maintained by Omolendu Guha. But these writings did reflect the Assamese nationalist perception. It was thought if the political actors had taken seriously the Roy Chaudhuri's concerns about the problems of Assam, the crisis emerged out of the problem of migration would not have intensified in the near future. The Assamese question situating Assam in India. Assam would continue to press her unique position in independent India. She would now share a long border with newly formed Pakistan, East Pakistan. Migration continued to grab our political attention as partition induced around 487,000 refugees into Assam. Taking part in the debate about federal list, Omyo Kumar Das, a veteran congressman from Assam, argued that the Assamese people needed protection for their culture as it was very unique. It had unique language which, though Sanskritic in origin, had got Tibetan and Burma influences. Inviting attention to the issue of migration, thus argued that the migration and naturalization should be put in the concurrent list, or the language so altered as to permit the province to have scope of action in these two subsects. Thus emphasized that mass migration into Assam had altered the demographic composition of the population, thus her distinct culture needed protection. However, it was defended on the ground that the Federation was responsible for maintaining the integrity of India, preserving its internal security, providing for its defense, and so on. An authority charged with these heavy responsibilities should have absolute power to make law controlling immigration and expulsion from the territory. Das's argument in Constituent Assembly did not find positive response. Neither did Ambika Giri's proposal for dual citizenship. B.R. Ambedkar denied a proposal to represent the ancient village-based polity of India built upon village and district panchayats. Instead, he proposed that India would be a dual polity with single citizenship. However, Omiya Kumar Das's argument clearly situated the case of Assam in the new nation state of India. Soon the problem of migration would be addressed in a different platform, uh, which is the provincial parliament. Owing to India's government repeated claims about hello.
Yeah, you're audible.
Okay.
You're audible.
Okay. Sorry, my slide is not moving actually. Okay.
Maybe you can exit and restart the full screen.
It's. I think it's on hold. Nothing is happening.
No, maybe try exiting the full screen of the PPT.
Nothing is working.
Oh.
Okay. Okay, fine.
Are you comfortable presenting without the slides?
No, actually, maybe I'll just quickly.
Sorry. How much time would it take for you to mail me the slide? Just mail me the slide and maybe you continue reading what's on this slide. Just mail your PPT. Share the screen from my.
Okay, fine. Sorry. Okay, I'll try exiting, shutting down, and I'll reconnect. Or should I just continue reading it without presentation?
I think you can continue reading. If you're able to see them, we can just listen to you.
Okay.
Have we lost Prarthana? I think. I don't think I can hear her or see her anymore.
No, I think her screen is frozen.
Yep. Did a computer just hang up or something?
I think so. What we could do is maybe start if she doesn't come in the next minute. I think we can move on to the next paper maybe instead of waiting. Yeah.
Sure. So that would be Kaustubh, are you ready to begin?
Yes.
And we might give Prarthana some time towards the end once she comes back. So Kaustubh Naik is currently doing his PhD at the University of Pennsylvania, looking at the early modern and modern histories of linguistic identity formations in colonial and post-colonial Goa, and broader histories of multilingual practices around India's southwest coast. His previous research has looked at identity formation and power negotiations amongst Goan Catholic and Hindu Bahujan communities through performance genres in the 20th century. He's also a playwright and was awarded the Tendulkar Dubey Fellowship for the year 2020 by the Vinod Doshi Foundation. His paper today is titled Caste and Religion in Postcolonial India, Goa and the Impossibility of a Merger.
Yeah. So, I mean, this is part of my the larger work that I'm trying to sort of do in my PhD, which looks at the relationship between region and language as it gets articulated in the post-colonial India, and the broader histories of it from the colonial period. Yeah. So, I'll just read out the paper. Yeah. Goa, a former Portuguese territory and the smallest state in the Indian Union, is often considered an aberration in the history of the Indian subcontinent. Thus, its inclusion in the broader narrative of the post-colonial Indian nation is marked by its difference, often referred to as Goa's unique culture. The uniqueness generally works as a proxy for simplistically stating Goa's 4.5 century Portuguese domination and the tensions of integrating Goa within the Indian Union in its post-colonial form. These tensions took an intensified form in Goa's post-colonial life, arguably in 1967, where an opinion poll was held to seek public opinion on deciding Goa's territorial future. The option was to remain as a union territory or merge with Maharashtra, its neighboring state. My paper aims to analyze the opinion poll of 1967 and the political anxieties that it brought to fore. To my understanding, these anxieties are pivotal in understanding the complex process of making contemporary Go. The opinion poll is a crucial moment where Goan exceptionality, a cultural character for Goa that was discernible from other regional formulations, had to be reinvented to adapt to the political realities of the post-colonial Indian nation state. Scholarly interpretations of Goa can be located between two hermeneutic extremes: the highly romanticized construction of Goa Durada and its nationalist reversal Goa Indica. Each of these frameworks intends to legitimize a particular historical course of what happened, yet negate each other. The celebration of the framework Goa Durada, which means a golden Goa or a happy empire, was strategically redeployed when the Portuguese colonialism foresaw a crisis arising from the locals. A nostalgic longing for this vision of Goa, perhaps imaginary, was largely sustained by the indigenous elites, Catholics as well as Hindus. On the other hand, Goa Indica owes its strength to the Indian nationalists and seeks to erase the role of Portuguese in the making of Goa by asserting Goa's primordial links with India through the Puranic texts. While there is a tendency among scholars to privilege these frameworks, they do not sufficiently capture the complexities of the Goan polity, both colonial and post-colonial, but rather obscure a number of internal contradictions. Secondly, both these frameworks have originated from elite upper caste locations and do not reflect the subaltern experience of the colonial state nor the post-colonial Indian nation. These frameworks also create a notion that Goa always has existed in its contemporary territorial expanse since the Portuguese first captured the city of Goa, often creating a homogeneous regional framing of Goa. Thus, this framework leave no scope for attending to the sorry. Thus, these frameworks leave no scope for attending to the provincialized histories of Goa. Goa was colonized under the Portuguese rule in a phased manner. The conquest of the island of Goa by Afonso de Albuquerque in 1510 marks the beginning of Portuguese rule in Goa. So, island of Goa would roughly refer to the city of Panjim and the area surrounding it that we know today. The Portuguese did not capture the entire Goan region as we know it today. The regions of Ilash, Salsette, Marmogao, and Bardez were conquered in the initial half of the 16th century. These regions were termed as the Old Conquests. The Old Conquest formed only one-fifth of the total area of present Goa. The other regions that comprise contemporary Goa, namely Bicholi, Kankon, Pedne, Ponda, Kepe, Sangye, and Sattari, came under the Portuguese rule only towards the end of the 18th century. These acquisitions were known as the New Conquests. The addition of New Conquests to the Estado da India in 18th century added to the Hindu population of Portuguese Goa. From about the mid-19th century, the strongly intensifying immigration of Goan Catholic communities to British Indian provinces, chiefly to the city of Bombay, changed the demographic relationship in favor of Hindus. This detail is crucial to understand the Marathi and the Maharashtradi politics within Goa. Uh, so, uh, what is happening here is that Goa is often sort of produced as this Catholic space or a Lusophone space, and somehow the demographic complexity of it is never sort of really brought out in its complete details. My work particularly looks at the Bahujan Samaj in Goa, which at some point in 20th century sort of transforms into a Maratha identity, as it was being also done in Maharashtra, for example. So, locating the Maratha identities in Goa, the Maratha identity was a relatively flexible social category and open to appropriation by urbanized jatis seeking upward mobility. In Portuguese Goa, many jatis claimed Maratha identity. The Kshatriya Maratha Samaj, which is the traditional fisher folks, the Gomantak Maratha Samaj, the traditionally temple servants and the Devdasis, the Naik Bhandaris or the Kshatriya Naik Maratha Samaj, the Kshatriya Komarpant Marathas, and the Gaud Marathas. Among these, the Kshatriya Maratha Samaj, Gomantak Maratha Samaj, Naik Bhandaris, Kshatriya Komarpant Maratha, and the Gaud Marathas together formed a loose conglomeration which was collectively known as the Bahujan Samaj in Goa. So, and the etymology of Bahujan Samaj is slightly different from, let's say, what we would have in northern India, for example. In early 20th century, Bahujan Samaj in Goa was engaged in contesting identity and mobilizing its caste. The Marathization of various jati within Bahujan Samaj was a step towards building a positive identity for themselves. The Gomantak Maratha Samaj's claims of Marathahood were based on the social aspects of Shivaji's polity, articulating a code of honor and cultural values, while the other Marathized groups within the Bahujan Samaj consolidated their Maratha identities around the concept of warrior heritage by claiming that they were employed in Shivaji's army. The invasions of Shivaji's army and later Maratha rule over some territories in Goa provided an impetus for the Bahujan Samaj towards Marathization. The process of Marathization created a tendency to identify Shivaji and Marathi as symbols of the identity of the Bahujan Samaj. Um, Speaking of the larger Marathi public sphere in Goa, through the centuries after the initial capture of the city of Goa in 1510, the Portuguese state and the Goan elite used Portuguese or Marathi for official, academic, and literary writing. The linguistic repertoires of 19th century Goans, therefore, were finely stratified. Elite Catholics and many elite Hindus were literate in Portuguese and Konkani, while elite Hindus were literate in Marathi in addition to Portuguese. The production of Krista Purana in the 17th century marks one definitive moment in the study of Marathi public sphere. Krista Purana is this translation of the Holy Bible by Jesuit priests, which sort of also translated the Bible into a certain Vaishnavite register and in Marathi's Bhakti lyrical form, which was called Ovi. Um, Marathi. So Jesuit missionaries in 17th century were reporting the enthusiasm with which Krista Puran was recited by the converts. Marathi was also employed in maintaining temple records, land grants, and also in local trade. But in the colonial period, it gained prominence after the integration of the new conquest in the Estado de India. The Portuguese state, after acquiring the new conquest territories, had to confront the challenge posed to its linguistic and cultural policies by Marathi. In 1843, Portuguese administration found it necessary to set up Marathi schools in the new conquest to facilitate accurate governance, since Marathi alone was spoken by one group of people and both old and new documents were written in that language. The reason offered by the Portuguese state for the setting up of Marathi schools in first half of the century was therefore a consequence of having to dilute its thrust towards cultural assimilation to accommodate the realities of governing the new conquest territories and the new requirements for acknowledging cultural difference. As Rochelle Pinto has argued, the state assured that Marathi would secure economic advancement among the Hindus of the new conquest and thus provided legislative space for it. The Portuguese state officials found it difficult to enforce Portuguese in New Conquest when they were told that the people in New Conquest refused to support primary schools in which it was a medium of instruction. A government order interpreted this as a defiance and threatened that the Kulkarnis and the Nadkarnis, or the clerks and the scribes from the New Conquest, would be overlooked when it came to job appointments in the municipal and land records offices in favor of those who were fluent in Portuguese. In 1847, however, despite these misgivings, and with the apparent ease that typified the contradictions within Portuguese policy, it was suggested that interpreters set up schools teaching Marathi, Hindustani, or Gujarati, and Gujarati applicable to the Portuguese territory of Daman and Diu, in each village. A far more important development of this time was the introduction of Marathi types in the national press in 1853. The national press was the only functioning press in the state and had been reintroduced after a ban of nearly 50 years in 1821. Court verdicts and announcements relating to land rights were printed in both Portuguese and Marathi in the government bulletin, the Bulletin Official. This established Marathi not only as the language of official documentation, but as the medium of communication between the state and its public as well. Marathi had won the status of dominant indigenous language within the Portuguese colonial administration, largely through the lobbying of influential groups such as interpreters, translators who were basically dominant caste Hindu men. They later became mediators between the Hindus of the new conquest and the Portuguese. Marathi had been accepted as the medium of state correspondence with its subject, which ensured jobs for those who were literate in Marathi, but educational policies were altered. Just as they had advocated the spread of English as a sign of their concern for migrant Catholics, the Catholic elite supported the demand made by Hindus for Marathi schools in New Conquest as their due. Miguel Vincent de Abreu, who intervened to convince the government to start Marathi schools in New Conquest, explained that since Hindus did not speak or read Portuguese at home, they found it extremely difficult to master the alphabet and usage. In contrast, he said they did not have such an aversion to Marathi as they knew how to read and write it, and since its pronunciation was not dissimilar to that of Konkani. Uh, the urgency of establishing Marathi schools was also linked with the land use policy and caste hierarchy within it. Land in Goa was administered through Comunidad or Gaonkaris. A Gaonkari is a village cooperative association that has absolute ownership over the land and functions independently as a self-governing establishment. The members of this cooperative are called Gaonkars, and the right to be a Gaonkar is hereditary to the male descendants of the Gaonkaria family. Many such Gaonkars from the new conquest were unlettered, and since the Kulkarnis were usually literate, the scribes were literate, they habitually triumphed over the Gaonkars by altering records as they pleased and getting Gaonkars to sign them. When the Gaonkars realized belatedly that they had been duped, it was the government that was inconvenienced by their complaints. There was also a growing anger in these regions against the Kulkarnis and against the methods by which the Gaonkarias were being run. Therefore, to avoid the legal and economic burden and the political disturbance that would evolve from this state of illiteracy, the government was urged to set up Marathi schools. Abreu's report was heeded, and schools teaching alternatively in Marathi and Portuguese would be set up all over Goa. Thus, in 1870, all the schools in New Conquest were converted to bilingual schools. Marathi was taught at the Liceu Nacional and the Escola Normal, which the college which trained teachers. The government's definition of the sphere of Marathi had widened to consider it not just as a language that eased administration, but also as the spoken and official language of the new conquests. The end of constitutional monarchy in Portugal ended the setting up of ended with the setting up of republic in October 1910. The setting up of republic offered religious freedom and provided voting rights to Hindus. It also saw progress in the education with the foundation of Marathi medium schools and the establishment of libraries, cultural associations, journals, and newspapers. By 1910, there were 8 Marathi schools in Goa, and the number went up to 66 by 1920-21. However, the consolidation of Marathi through the colonial state apparatus largely benefited only the Hindu elites. The Bahujan caste was scripting their trajectory with Marathi beyond the realm of the state. As the access to education for the Bahujan caste was restricted, their participation in Marathi public sphere was largely mediated through other forms of communications, majorly the Marathi theatre. Histories of Marathi theatre have not sufficiently accounted the presence and popularity of Marathi theatre in Goa. As such, the socio-political aspect of Marathi theatre in Goa have not realized fully. Goa was an integral part of the circuit within Marathi performances were being distributed since the late 19th century. In addition to being host to performances by traveling theatre companies from British Indian provinces, Marathi plays by Goan troops were being staged at the temples during village festivities as a service to the presiding deity. I argue that these plays, patronized through local institutions such as the temple committees, became sites of assertion of identities, transcending their mere ritualistic and entertaining nature. Marathi theatre in Goa emerged in the late 19th century and was performed largely in temples as service to God. Temples in Goa extend into performance spaces with elevated performance space facing the idol or the temple deity. Most of these performances were staged by local Bahujan communities from the villages. These plays were performed. The plays that were performed were broadly of
Kaustubh,
two genres.
sorry, you have 5 minutes left.
Oh, okay. So I think I will just skip this section. Um, so basically, I'm arguing that there are three factors: the Marathization of Bahujan caste, the possibility of upward mobility opened by Marathi education, and the affinities forged between the Bahujan Samaj and the Maratha past through Marathi theatre. Which I mean, I'm looking at a very specific genre of Marathi theatre, which is performing the plays around Shivaji, and that I argue was one of the reason why there was some cultural affinity was being produced within the Bahujan Samaj and Marathi. Um, so these three factors created conditions for what I call, borrowing from Gopal Guru's formulation, as the promise of Maharashtra. The Marathi-speaking region that was carved out of Bombay Presidency in 1960 in the course of linguistic reorganization of states, just a year before the Portuguese sovereignty over Goa ended, had become a space where aspirations of Goan Bahujans could be realized. Moreover, the merger with Maharashtra implied weakening of the dominance of local elites who dominated the Bahujans more closely than the Portuguese colonial state. Importantly, by the way of merger, the Bahujan could deterritorialize their caste-specific oppression and assimilate into in the larger dominant Maratha public within Maharashtra, putting therefore an end to the process of Marathization. So I'll just skip over the point where I look at the opinion poll, which was a political party called Maharashtra Gomandak Party came to power in Goa in 1963. The party was largely sort of driven by a certain idea of Bahujan upliftment. It talked about redistributing land to the tiller, and one of the major promise that they made was to merge Goa with Maharashtra. And it faced with a certain opposition to an extent that it was decided that a public opinion poll will be held. And when the opinion poll was held, the larger sentiment was against the merger, and Goa remained the union territory. Goa remained as a union territory and did not get merged with Maharashtra. Um, Bandodkar, who was the MGP leader, wait, I'm just so I think I'll just read the last section. What I'm trying to look at is what were the forces that were trying to sort of work for and against the merger. So regions can be understood not merely as geographical terrains contained in arbitrary boundaries, but also as modern imagined communities. Therefore, it is imperative that one underscores the locus of these imaginations, especially to assess which imaginations get consolidated and sustained, and which imaginations are written off in due course of history. The discursive production of post-colonial Indian national identity has often written off many attachments to culture, history, ethnicity, and sovereignty that did not materialize in the current federal arrangement. The case of Goa, as I explained here, hints at the manner in which post-colonial Indian nation state operates, where regional imaginations that enable locally dominant caste groups to consolidate their power through a culturally produced regional identity on one hand, while arrests possibility of imagination that seeks to counter such consolidation on the other. The impossibility of Goa's merger with Maharashtra invites us to think the manner in which regional imaginations are driven by caste in India. The anti-mergerist votes largely came from Goan Catholic communities and the upper caste Hindu elites, that is the Gaud Saraswat Brahmins. It was obvious for the Goan Catholics to not vote in favor of merger, as they saw merger as a possibility that could further marginalize them in a Hindu dominant polity. It is rather interesting to assess why the Saraswats, who had consolidated their positions in Goa through their knowledge of Marathi and found employment opportunities in Bombay Presidency, to significantly oppose the merger. The Saraswats had immensely benefited and consolidated their dominance over temples and land through their intimacy with the colonial state. These benefits were safeguarded by acts and policies institutionalized during the colonial period. The Comunidad system of land ownership, or the Mahajan Act, a legal framework that governs temple ownership and rights, were exclusively benefiting the continued dominance of Saraswats in Goa. Culturally too, as Urmila Patil's work has shown, the Brahmin status of the Saraswats was not fully recognized in the Marathi-speaking regions, and the Saraswats had a tense relationship with the other Brahmin jatis in Maharashtra, such as the Chitpavans and Deshas. Therefore, being merged in Maharashtra would have weakened their dominance and thus had to be averted. In the couple of decades that followed the opinion poll, the Saraswats also led the movement to recognize Goa as a full-fledged state in the Indian Union, with Konkani as the Konkani language as a defining cultural marker of Goan identity, effectively overwriting the relationship several Goan communities had with Marathi. I think I'll just stop here and yeah.
Thank you so much, Kaustubh, for such an interesting paper, and thank you for keeping time. Prarthana is back. Prarthana, would you like to present now? You have 7 minutes left from where you left. I don't see her again. Okay, I think we should just move on to the next presenter, then that would be Ardra, I think.
Okay. And if maybe there's time in the end, we can let Prarthana go after all the papers are done. I'd like to invite Meena Menon to present her paper. Meena Menon is currently a postgraduate researcher at the University of Leeds, but she, of course, has a very long and distinguished career as a journalist, working for a number of different publications, including the Times of India, Midday United, and UNI. Most recently, she was deputy editor at The Hindu, which she left in 2015, and is the author of several works, including Riots and After in Mumbai, Reporting Pakistan, which is an account of her 9 months as the foreign correspondent in Islamabad, and most recently is a co-author of A Frayed History, The Journey of Cotton in India. Her paper today looks at, it's titled From the Paika Rebellion to the Anti-POSCO Movement in Odisha.
Thank you so much, Rohit. And I also want to thank the other Rohit and all the people at Cambridge for organizing this and inviting me to speak. I'm going to share my screen in just a minute. Please bear with me. Yeah, so my paper is basically based on my case study. I hope I'm audible. On the anti-POSCO movement in Odisha, in Jagatsinghpur district. This was over a decade-long agitation to evict POSCO, a South Korean steel company, which was planning to set up a project in Jagatsinghpur in Kujang Tehsil, Elsama block. And it was going to acquire about 4,000 acres of land for the project, which included a steel plant and a power project and a port. And it also had special economic zone status for tax benefits. So the memorandum was signed between POSCO and the state of Odisha on June 22nd, 2005. And protests started almost immediately. Even in the villages, there were people marching around the affected villages of Dinkia, Noaga, and Gadkujang, saying no POSCO, POSCO go back. So this was a significant project in the sense that it was India's largest foreign direct investment till then of $12 billion, and it was very prestigious. There's a special cell in the PMO to monitor this project, and so you can imagine the amount of pressure that was on the people to conform. So the CPI, the Communist Party of India, for those who don't know, it's one of the two major communist parties in India, formed the POSCO Pratirod Sangram Samiti on July 11, 2005. And soon after that, there was this, there were huge protests, there were padyatras, and immediately they had a lot of national and international support. So one of the key reasons for the support that people gave the newly formed PPSS was the fact that they were used to industry. Industrial development was very close to them in the form of Paradip Port, which is India's first deep water port, built in the 60s. It's about 12 kilometers from the project site. And lots of land was acquired for various projects, and the people didn't get the promised jobs or the so-called development in those areas. So they thought that POSCO would be one more nail in the coffin. So that area is also highly polluted. In 2016, the Indian Institute of Technology, Delhi, identified Paradip as one of the country's critically polluted zones. So there are already 10 major industries there, and an 11th one, I mean, a new one was the Indian Oil Refinery, which is literally where the backyard of the proposed POSCO project. And there are still agitations going on against IOCL because they haven't given the promised jobs or the CSR funds. The other major issue there is that land was a motivating factor in the protest, because a number of people don't own land there. This is Jagat Singhpur district, where there are more scheduled caste people as residents than in the state of Odisha, and most of them don't own land. So about 30% of these people in the three crucial villages didn't own land, and they cultivated forest land. So what happened was that this forest land, they had customary rights, and the customary rights extended to them right from when this area was part of Kujang Kingdom, which was part of the Bardwan princely estate. And unfortunately, while the rights were settled in many of these estates, in this part it wasn't, and the land was acquired by the Odisha under the Forest Act. So people still use those customary rights. And in 2006, the Forest Right Act was passed in India, which gave people who were dependent on forest and had cultivated it for over 3 generations a chance to get titles. But what happened here was, in this project area, the Odisha government refused to recognize the rights and also refused to acknowledge that the Gram Sabhas had rejected the diversion of forest land as the act allows. So despite the fierce protests, land was acquired, and I just want to show you the project area, which had about hundreds of trees, lakhs of trees were cut. And in 2013, the Industrial Development Corporation of Odisha acquired land, and about 1,700 hectares was handed over to POSCO. So these were now lands on which these people cultivated. They had customary rights, but all that was denied. But strangely, the government did give them compensation. The beetle vine owners, just want to show you the beetle vines. This is how these plots look. They're small plots. Each plot is very tiny, but about annually an income of 100,000 or 1 lakh a farmer can get from these plots. They provide employment to many people. And this is also a very fertile region. You can see rivers. There's a lot of fishing. There's paddy. There's the pandanus flower, which is very lucrative. So it's a region where there's very little migration. So the people, I think, rallied around to save what they had in terms of land and livelihoods. And one of their slogans was "POSCO Hatao, Bita Mati Bachao." So Bita Mati is a very spiritual and tangible concept of the habitat, which was also used in the agitation at Balyapal, which is quite significant because it stopped the national missile testing range there. And the Communist Party of India also had a role to play in that agitation. And they brought some of the tactics to this agitation in Jagat Singhpur. So POSCO Hatao, so Bita Mati was, if you ask people why did you oppose POSCO, they'll say to save the Bita Mati. It's a natural, it's a spontaneous kind of reaction. And the other thing was Pan, Meen and Dhan, which is like a lifeline for the region. So Pan is Pan, beetle vine, Meen, fish, and Dhan is paddy. This is the kind of setting for this agitation. I just want to say that the PPSS was formed in 15 days after the Memorandum of Understanding, and it was the Communist Party of India which took the initiative. It nominated a leader, Abhay Sahu. I won't burden you with names, but this is one name you could remember because he's an important player as the leader of the POSCO Pratirod Sangram Samiti. And he's a long-time CPI member. It's also interesting that this area had a kind of the Communist Party of Odisha was formed in 1936, and it was very much part of the Congress and the Congress Socialist Party in mobilizing peasants, and also eventually taking part in the Quit India movement, in the Salt Satyagraha, where Kojang and Jagat Singh Pur, there was a lot of activity there. So there is that kind of back history to the CPI, and it also, after independence, did win a number of seats in the Ersama constituency in assembly elections, as well as in parliament. And one of the MPs, Loknath Chowdhury, was the one who, articulated this whole protest against this development vision that the state had. So it does have a presence, CPI, in the coastal areas of Odisha, and it was also active in against the Tata Steel project in Gopalpur, in Ganjam district. So, but the party was weakened after 64 because of the split. They became two major communist parties, and in Odisha, further weakened by a lot of the communist cadres joining the Marxist-Leninist groups, which are quite, peripherally active still. And also the trade unions in Paradeep have a CPI union. So, just to go quickly to the tactics, what did they do to stop this project? They blockaded the villages. They didn't allow anyone inside. This was in 2007. At the same time, there was a mobilization of men, women, children, and Sahu used to, do padyatras around the affected villages. He would, take a megaphone. He dressed very simply. He lived there. He lived for 9 years in Dinkia. At a time, they were proposing this huge project. There was no electricity even in those villages, and even now it's extremely erratic. So he suffered all that, and he lived there. He left his family. So all this was very attractive to the people who felt that he was different from the usual political party leaders. But at the same time, there was another opposition to the PPSS coming up. So this was the United Action Committee, which kind of gave a memorandum to the state government saying, please, don't leave us out in the cold in terms of rehabilitation. Unfortunately, there were tensions between the two groups, and there was lots of violence. A lot of people died in bomb blasts, in group clashes. Then there was a lot of firing. Women were injured. Rubber bullet injuries, which they suffered for a long time. So the tactics were to blockade, and when the blockade kind of failed, then they started putting pressure nationally and internationally. But I won't go into that. But they had a lot of support. There were solidarity groups in cities. People came and expressed, like Meena Patkar, Vandana Shiva, the late Swami Agnivesh, B.D. Sharma ji. A lot of people supported them, and they did a lot of lobbying internationally as well. So I chose to study the PPSS. It's part of my project, PhD project. The other movement I'm studying is the Narmada Bachao Andolan. And one of the reasons I was interested in is that it was a very significant movement in terms of its tactics, and also the groundswell of opinion it managed to mobilize, and the number of women. So for a while, there was this perception that women were leading the movement. So all this was a very attractive thing for me to compare with my other the other movement that I was studying. So my hypothesis was that the PPSS evolved from, the ground, the local people opposed to the project, and, it was their idea. But that unfortunately didn't seem to be the case, because I think there was a strong involvement of the CPI and Abhay Sahu. And what also happened was that they didn't allow anyone else to have a role to play there. So that coastal area, as you know, is prone to cyclones, and the super cyclone of 99 in Ersama kind of devastated the whole area. But it also got a lot of NGOs and aid agencies there, and these people had a good network with the community. In fact, they were the ones who mobilized support against POSCO. But these groups, some of them had to leave in 2008 because of differences with the Anti-POSCO PPSS leadership. So the other thing that came up in the course of discussion was corruption. And this mainly involved taking 23,000,000 from a company, private company, which was given to the PPSS in the name of village development and legal aid, because by then there were over 500 cases filed against the people, and there are still 625 non-bailable warrants. So, but unfortunately, there's no account of this. And when people, some of them raised questions about this with the leadership, they eventually had to leave the village and they were not allowed to return. So, some of the tactics that PPSs used was also this kind of social boycott, fining people for not attending meetings. This was all done in the name of crowdfunding the movement. So when I asked the leaders about this whole transparency issue, they said it didn't matter because it's not really their problem to see whether accounts are kept, and they really didn't think that it was important. And also other people I interviewed, in journalists and public intellectuals, felt that to probe corruption in a social movement like this was really not the done thing, because they were up against this huge conglomerate of corporate and governments which were far more corrupt. So, but I think I still intend to pursue that theme in my research, because I think it's a very important context that corruption is being. Often the CPI has this tag of being corrupt because in fact, the politicians in Odisha say, "Oh, it's very easy to give CPI money and corrupt them." So that's also something interesting that I need to look into. And what eventually I sort of, I'm going to jump to the conclusion that the PPSS was in fact like a political party, though it didn't want to be one. In fact, the CPI at the time when it set up PPSS clearly said that they coined the slogan "Aage Mati, Piche Party." So first Mother Earth and then the party. So they kind of denied or did not accept that they were a political outfit. They were only supported by CPI. But eventually, what happened was there was no accountability. The leadership seemed autocratic, and women were used in this kind of tokenistic fashion, and their bodies as well. So. However, despite these conclusions that I have drawn, the people I met felt that Sahu was a very motivational leader, and it was but for him the whole movement would never have taken off. Women would never have come out on the street, and there would be, POSCO would have happened. But now, at the end of the movement, after POSCO withdrew in 2017, there is a kind of bitterness. And now people say that the next leader should come from among them. So, transparency is one thing, and the other thing is violence. So, ostensibly, PPSS was a Gandhian organization. And even though some people said it's Marxist, Leninist, mean CPI, but people were generally supposed to be non-violent. But then they responded to a lot of the violence from the police and the administration and gundas allegedly hired by POSCO. So there was also retaliation. In fact, the person who killed one of the PPSS supporters his hand was cut off, and the women kind of really retaliated for their children being assaulted by the police by taking off policemen's uniforms, by removing their caps, feeding them grass. And they also stripped on 2 occasions, to emulate the women in the Mera Parebis in Manipur who stripped in front of the Assam Rifles headquarters in 2004. So there was all that aspect to the movement.
Meena, you have about 4 minutes left.
I'll just finish. So he also wanted to put children in the forefront, and that was the state didn't take too kindly to that. So what was totally crushing, I think, in the end was that the state gave that despite this intense agitation, despite all this, the state did not give them the land. They just gave it to another, company, Jindal Steelworks, which is setting up a huge project at exactly the same place. So, and PPSS did not work, on a second rung of leadership. But despite that, there are still people who are thinking of protesting against Jindal, but they're deterred by the number of cases and the fact that they could be arrested. So I just want to end, since I have to discuss also the questions mainly. So when it comes to, this is the area where the Paika rebellion also took place partly, and 2017 was the bicentenary of that movement, and the state is now building, you can see Bakshi Jagabandhu, he was the leader. There's a memorial to them. There are stamps. But this is also a memorial to the martyrs of Karinganagar who were killed in 2006 for, again, exactly like a POSCO agitation, claiming for their land. So, what is the response of the state to different kinds of movements? One is that it's glorifying the past movements against the British as nationalist. It is welfare oriented in some aspects because of the cyclones. I mean, their management of the cyclone and the shelters is remarkable. But on the other hand, there is support for corporates. I mean, beyond support, it's totally on their side, and they repress people's struggles. And it's the people themselves who spoke about this divide and rule strategy to divide people's opposition and, kind of degrade them, saying that only a fringe is opposing these projects. And also this thing of, tarnishing the left as easily corruptible. So these are some of the questions that arise from my preliminary research, and I think I see PPSS as part of a continuum of movements since Chipko, seeking to articulate the rights of the people over land and resources and the relationship, as you can see in this case, with the Bita Mati. So it's like against an impervious state, which is really the worrying aspect of this whole agitation. And also we must remember that there are about nearly 70 million people who have been displaced because of the high modernist and liberalization policies of development, and that's still continuing. So I think I'll end on this note, and I'll be happy to take any questions. Thank you very much for this opportunity.
Thanks, Meena. And you can see there are already some questions that we put into the chat, so hopefully we'll get to those towards the end. Our last paper is by Dr. Ardra Neelakandan Girija, who is currently faculty at the Department of International Relations and Politics, Central University of Kerala. Dr. Girija has a PhD from Center for Political Studies, JNU, and thesis was titled Politics of Aesthetics, the Question of Culture in the Communist Movement in Kerala. Her interests include political and cultural history of modern Kerala, contemporary social movements, Marxism, and aesthetico-political philosophy and cultural studies. Her paper is titled Thinking Politics in the Vernacular, Marxist Praxis and the Early Intellectual History of the Communist Movement in
Kerala. Thank you, Professor Day, and thank you, Rashmi. I will just begin by thanking the organizers of this workshop for this opportunity to be here and be heard in the presence of these wonderful scholars. And I'm overwhelmed by Menon's presentation, and some issues are closer to heart than others. So I have to begin with a note of apprehension about the paper. This is a combination of two separate sections from my doctoral thesis. The result kind of an attempt at unpacking the thesis in a different way for me. And as an early career scholar, it's also kind of trying to play with the thesis and trying to bring out things that didn't seem possible at the point of submission. So there could be some sort of inconsistencies, or I will try to, give it some degree of comprehensiveness though. This paper tries to frame two moments in the early intellectual history of the communist movement in Kerala, in juxtaposition to the notion of conceptual translation of Marxist philosophy. It has been generally argued that the early discourse of Malayali communism primarily adopted a mechanism of transmission of ideas rather than translation, owing to several factors, including the lack of access to original Marxist texts as opposed to shortcuts or handbooks or short courses. Then some intrinsic inadequacy of the nascent public sphere in Kerala to nurture an ideology of equality and fraternity like communism, and even the Savarna Brahmin identity of the majority of the leaders and ideologues. So these are some of the reasons, factors that could have contributed to the activity being a mere transmission rather than translation of Marxist ideology. I just want to mention Dilip Menon's work on communism and caste in India, and particularly in Kerala, as a well-known example of the instance of the above-mentioned discourse. I shall try and argue that even in the early years itself, there has been a strand of grounded translation. The term I borrow from Jayadevika's work, not in the context of communism, but in the context of local feminist initiatives. She's used the term grounded translation. And this grounded translation, and I also want to connect this early discourse, which I argue that has had long-term consequences in establishing and retaining the electoral and, more importantly, the intellectual hegemony of the movement in the region, which is amply clear even from the recent elections. And if you look at any social media platforms and in the kind of discussions that we have, the Marxist terminology, the ideological, mechanisms that are used are very. The presence of Marxist ideology is hegemonic in the public sphere even today. I take the retrospective texture analysis kind of method with a clear view of the later critiques the movement faced, especially from new social movements, the feminist movement, the Dalit, and the environmental movements. Since the collective here is a well-informed one in the history of South Asia, I am not going into a lot of detailed background description of the region or the movement. And if in case there's some lack of clarity, we can talk about it later. The particular two movements I have in mind is taken from the working of the cultural front of the Communist Party from late 1930s, and I have a decade in mind to the late 1940s. The importance of cultural fronts of a communist movement cannot be overstated in building the movement in the grassroots. The first cultural front was formed in 1937, which is modeled after the Progressive Writers Association of the Hindi-Urdu terrain in 1936. And in the international scenario, as we all know, the anti-war front of leftist writers was formed in Paris in 1935, led by Maxim Gorky. This particular cultural front I have in mind was called the Jival Sahitya Sangham, or literally can be translated as the Association for Lively Literature. It was founded by several left intellectuals and writers, including EMS Namboodiripad. The emergent intellectual public sphere of Kerala, already populated by the missionary writings from the 19th century, royalist novels, social novels, which made popular by the print technology, radical newspapers and journals working alongside the anti-colonial national movement, the vibrant anti-caste social reform movements from the margin, as well as upper caste communities. So all these movements are already present in this intellectual public sphere. And to this matrix, this leftist group started working. Their approach was two-pronged, the official approach. One, rejecting the traditional cultural theories and practices around literature and art. Two, disseminating the new aesthetics, the Nava Saundarya Bodham, among the masses, thus enabling them to make social progress. The primary readings I have here are a few essays by EMS Namboodiripad. That's the ideologue I am going to discuss in detail. I shall address him as EMS rather than by his surname because he was popularly called so. Just comes easier to me. And these essays were published at different points between 1937 to 1949. And some of them were published under pseudonyms because for a large part of the time the Communist Party was underground. And this was later compiled and published by the publishing house of the Communist Party in 1974. The first moment I am going to discuss, it draws a relationship between politics, history, and literature by conjuring a binary picture of the contemporary world while spelling out an interpretation of dialectics unique to the vernacular setting. And the second one attempts to respond to a worldwide debate around art for art versus art for life or society. So the first section is writing dialectics in Malayalam. In an article published by EMS in 1937 in a prominent weekly, was titled Living Literature and the Aesthetic Sense, he addresses an emergent readership, the literate and the politicized masses, and Kerala, also, it was also the time of a library movement which was very active, and the number of literate people was growing quite huge numbers around that time. And he defends the new writing, that something, that was coming up in Malayalam, which he termed as Jival Sahityam, as against the old one. As the old one, the new one caters to the new readership and enables them in their collective progress. So it tries to draw a very linear connection between writing and social progress here, while defining the nature of literature and its intrinsic connection to the material structure around it. He depicts this material structure in an international perspective. Let us briefly discuss that structure here. He identifies two broad forces in the world, and again, this is late 1930s. These two broad forces encompasses the national as well as local scenarios, of course, including international ones. Politically, this division will be fascism, imperialism, capitalism, and landlordism on the one hand, and ideologies of liberation, nationalism, democracy, and socialism on the other. Socially, he has a very local focus, and on the one side, the regressive side has untouchability, matriliny, and forced widowhood, and the progressive camp has equality, freedom, and male female fraternity. If a writer is progressive in his approach, through his activity of writing, he will be expected to support and strengthen the latter set of forces against the former one, CMS argues. This material structure, as he describes, further elucidates a particular worldview that he could have constructed only from the specific location, that of the late colony, ridden with all the challenges presented by rapid and sweeping transformations. There are numerous studies about the modernity, the kind of Kerala modernity, which we understand now. So I'm not going into those discussions. What were those rapid and sweeping transformations? The effort, the particular effort is here to establish the emergence of such a literature as part of the realization of a larger progressive philosophy or worldview vis-a-vis the politico-economic working alignments at all levels, from the local to the international. Thus, writing progressively or producing progressive literature is much more than simple or direct propaganda in terms of taking a political position or enabling a certain political mobilization for him. It should involve a philosophical engagement with the materialist understanding of history of the world itself in general, and that of aesthetics and the task of the critique in particular. The global context of 1940s, as we know, is sharply polarized between these forces and the emergence of fascism and all the associated forces. And it was very interesting how he suggested that all the axes of progress to come together and work in solidarity with the larger political battle against the forces of fascism, imperialism, and colonialism. And this was to become the basic framework of Jival Sahitya Prasthanam and a lot of cultural fronts that were to happen, that were to, form and work in Kerala. And Kerala is well known for the cultural fronts the Communist Party has put up time and again. And the activist writers were expected to write in order to strengthen the forces of progress and emancipation. Within this shared paradigm of cultural resistance, EMS tried to push further towards a deeper philosophical convergence that was desirable, scientific, and hence progressive. He called it a kind of a Prabanja Tattvajnanam, which could be translated as universal philosophy. There is an explicit call here for a rethinking about the relationship between knowledge, ideology, progress, and history. He deliberately argues for even understanding scientific knowledge as a subjective knowledge production. And he kind of actually also blurs the divisions between creative literature, scientific literature, critical literature. He calls it all a kind of in a broad category of writing itself. And the regressive ideology is not merely false consciousness for him that can be eliminated through a psychological confrontation. Rather, the operation of this ideology is closely intertwined with those material forces of history that determine its movement. And also to keep in mind, this was also a time where most important, significant Marxist texts were unavailable in Malayalam or even in English. Some of these leaders were, well versed in English, but a lot of texts that we kind of read now commonly. So he only indicated the method rather than kind of providing a solution to this dilemma between knowledge and ideology. He indicated a method to reject the backward looking ideological implications through scientific ways of knowing and that knowledge which strengthened the progressive forces. And ideology in this sense appears to be a materially founded one and not in a kind of response to the base superstructure debate in Marxism in a rather informed manner, I believe. And again, he talks about a lot of local issues in connection to the global issues, and this particular mechanism is not without its own contradictions. So, in the immediate context, he kind of forged a larger group of progressively oriented people. Were not communists who were not socialists, but he could forge a large group of people under the aegis of this cultural front, and which was very instrumental in the later period, especially in 1957 when the government came to power with the MSS chief minister. Most importantly, as we can see, the attempt here is to provide the movement with a deeper epistemological grounding in the dialectical materialist philosophy. The world for EMS was divided into two philosophical and political camps. By depicting the modern world as two large camps of mutually hostile forces, EMS was in fact putting forth a grand canvas of history as a great dialectic. As we can clearly identify, the picture is far from being a true representation of the existing reality. Especially, it's simple and oversimplified at times, and the binary has a very linear kind of approach to history. Most of the individual forces in one camp have complex relationships with the forces in the other. Just for an instance, the scientific rationality cannot, cannot coexist without the capitalist initiatives on the one hand, or on the one hand he has matrilini, which he considered as as bad as the untouchability, for instance. And but it's very imperative to explain the radical transformation of the Malayali society to understand this, to contextualize especially seeing matrilini as a bane, just like untouchability. And this emphasis, especially about matrilini being in the regressive camp, was significant in the later periods in Kerala, where a lot of contradictions in the women empowerment paradigm exist. On the one hand, the rates, all kinds of rates of women development is huge. At the same time, it's a very rather unfriendly society and a very conservative society for women to live in. Despite the above-mentioned contradictions, the simple narrative translates the Hegelian dialectics and its Marxist reformulation to the local context of anti-colonial and anti-feudal resistance. And the simplification, yeah.
Ardra, you have 5 minutes. Sorry.
Yeah. Oh, sure. So I'll just go to the second moment. And the second moment, I just want to introduce another person who was a radical intellectual of the period. It was called A. Balakrishna Pilla, or fondly known as Kesari, who edited a journal, Kesari. And this has to do with the word Jival Sahityam itself. The word Jival Sahityam, as I said, means lively literature. And EMS had a problem with calling it Jival Sahityam from the first instance itself, because he thought that it cannot carry the idea of progress sufficiently. And he wanted it to be called progressive literature rather. And one of the reasons he said that life has a lot of a variety of possibilities to go forward. It needn't be progressive all the time. When you call it a progressive literature, you would rather want a future-oriented literature to come. And Kesari becomes important here because they in the later periods, these two represent like large camps of intellectuals fighting and calling names and very nasty kind of debate. That's why I'm taking these two. And Kesari, but very skillfully wanted it to be called Jival Sahityam because of exactly because of the same reason, where life offers a lot of opportunities, and a lot of characters could come in who needn't fit into the idea of progress the way the communist leadership wanted to define. And one of the things that happened because of this division, this problem between calling the progressive literature lively literature, was that at a later period, as I've argued in my thesis, is that a lot of times social progress came to be equated with moral progress in the communist discourse in Kerala. So, moral progress, especially, that's why I also mentioned the question about matrilineal being regressive. Moral progress was considered almost as equal as social progress, and a lot of writers were shunned and critiqued and thoroughly even restricted to be presented as writers in the public sphere in the later periods. And the roots of that, this especially people like Kamala Das were brutally attacked by the communist critiques at the later period for being social, being against social progress. So I think the roots of that critique also lies in the way, kind of parallel before the Soviet kind of the Janovist period and the Soviet cultural policies that this is happening. So I think it's very pertinent to see how this problem with it couldn't kind of understand the excesses that life provided to literature and wanted to streamline the process. So these are the two instances of dealing with uh, a Marxist ideology, and kind of wanted to. A lot of it is now. I think a lot of points have not been made properly, and I'm not sure how much it could understand because of its haphazard manner. But I want to end here, and thanks everyone again.
Thank you.
Thank you. I was just checking, Prarthana, if you wanted to finish your talk. As Rashmi mentioned, we have about 7 minutes.
Yeah, sure. Is this visible?
Yes.
Okay. So I left in the 1950s when Assam made her case presented in the platform like the Constituent Assembly debates and the provincial parliament. And I'm starting with the 1960s and ending in 1970s and 80s. So the decade of 1960 would thoroughly witness the greater involvement of Assamese speaking educated class who would raise voice for legislative and administrative measures to handle the problem of migration, leading to public paranoia about doubtful citizens and migrants. After the publication of census data 1961, the government adopted certain measures to check infiltration from Pakistan. In 1962, the Special Power of Foreigners Act was made use of the police resorting to the court of law initiated a drive against the infiltrator. However, the role of the police was questionable. As acting with the nation-state framework, many such officials also hope to serve as affiliated Assamese nationality question. I have shared, I'm sharing a note, a paragraph from autobiography of a police officer who was serving during that scheme. To scrupulously avoid harassment of any Indian citizen, Government of India would soon arrange an improvement by appointing statutory tribunals under Foreigners Tribunals Order 1964, which aimed to set up the tribunals to decide the nationality of alleged illegal immigrants. This marked the intervention of the judiciary in the matter of citizenship in India and showed how Assamese middle class not only impacted the execution of citizenship laws in grounds, but also successfully bargained the bringing important changes to the citizenship laws. Little nationalism and citizenship, the Assamese middle class versus the government of India. The Indo-Pak War in 1971 and subsequent migration of refugees into the state of India, including Assam, once more highlighted the issue of migration in Assam. Assam received about 298,000 refugees until 31st October 1971. The central government's welcoming attitude towards the refugees raised genuine apprehensions, and it was thought that the government adopted a discriminatory attitude towards indigenous people of Assam. Meanwhile, the writings in Assamese reflected a public opinion forming against the central government for its exploitative attitude towards Assam. One such I have referred, I have mentioned in the PPT, which is Islamabad Bonam Dhaka, wrote by a trade union leader who would emerged a very powerful leader during the popular protest of 1980s. Evidently, Assam was rephrasing its nationality question within the federal structure of India. In the early days of 1979, historian Amalendu Guha noticed the problem of integration. Offering his conceptualization of little nationalism, Guha placed Assam's national question on the linguistic regional plane and tried to find a solution to its integration with the Indian nationalists. Earlier, Guha maintained that the nationality question in Assam was essentially the ideology of the small and unconsolidated middle class, which could successfully rally the peasants through floating its cause as national cause. Guha's hoped for united India, organized on the basis of the reorganization of the recognition of Indian multinationality, federal principles of state reorganization with single citizenship, and protection of the democratic rights of all national minorities and their language, including the right of self-determination. However, he would soon observe how the little nationalism in Assam turned chauvinist under the leadership of the Assamese middle class. Nevertheless, led by the Assamese middle class, the popular protest during 1980s would substantiate these questions and within the federal principles of single citizenship in India. Across the table, the civil society or the middle class in Assam played a very crucial role while organizing these people during the popular protest. And you can see in the PPT that they have played a very crucial role in identifying the illegal foreigners. The police officers, especially the Assamese police officers, they shared the 1951 NRC copy and the Form 7, and then distributed in different parts of Assam to identify illegal foreigners in their personal capacity. So across the table, the popular protest in 1980s revised the original question about membership, who is a foreigner. This time, however, an answer would be sought within the legal framework of citizenship. The protest against illegal foreigners, launched under the leadership of ASU, forcefully raised the Assamese nationality question against the problem of migration. During the hundreds and rounds of meeting between 1980 to 85, the Assamese leaders would represent the Assamese middle class, discussed and influenced the legal discourse of citizenship. In around 114 days of meeting until 1983, they proposed various legal measures to be taken by the Indian government to stop influx from Bangladesh. Significantly, the matter of Assam's national identity was also placed. The demand to provide a constitutional safeguards to protect the identity of the people living in Assam, and this was brought during the very first meeting between ASU and the government of India. The Center Assam Brigade would reflect distinctly during the discussion about who is foreigner and cut-off date to identify the illegal foreigners. Intending to safeguard the refugees from Bangladesh, the central government pushed the question of international commitment and humanitarian ground. It was informed that all the illegal foreigners would be deported except those who were given permission to live in India under the Nehru-Liaquat Pact and Indira Mujib Pact. The Assamese leaders defended Assam's earlier position about refugee and proposed that bona fide refugees who would not be identified as illegal foreigners would be settled in other parts of the India. The central government pressed the year 1971 on the goal.
Could you wind up your paper quickly?
Yeah. Yes. The highly animated bargain continued parallel to the street demonstrations by organizations like ASO, which were used to create pressures on the negotiation table. In contrast, the central government used the technique of imposition of election in different points of time and to get hold of the law and order situation. This led to violence and led to the central government's non-negotiable mood. The final, you can see here, like locally, the ASU and the other organizations, how they organized against the elections, imposition of the elections. Here we can see the grenade, preparation of the grenade and the preparation of protest balloons by the local leaders. And finally, we reached to the Assam Accord and the Citizenship Amendment Act. The bargain would come to an end with the signing of the accord on 15th August 1985. The accord central premise was certainly founded on the citizenship question. The clause 5 of the accord dealt with it. However, the nationality question, which has been pressed by the Assamese middle class for over these years, was found placed in clause 6. It promised that constitutional, legislative, and administrative safeguards as may be appropriated shall be provided to protect, preserve, and promote the cultural, social, and linguistic identity and heritage of the Assamese people. This clause entangled the Assamese nationality question with citizenship. The Assamese little nationalism found an expression within a document like the Assam Accord, marking a significant shift in the citizenship discourse in India. The first amendment of Citizenship Act 1955 in December 1985 would validate this shift. A bill for the amendment was introduced in the Lok Sabha to handle the foreigners' questions in Assam, and on the basis of the entrance from the Bangladesh to Assam, the migrants were differentiated in different categories, and accordingly it was handled. The paper showed how a notion of membership from through vernacular literary culture found legitimate place in legal framework of citizenship. It analyzed how, while transitioning from colonial subjects to citizens of independent India, the notion of membership evolved into a bargain between center state. This also redefined the question of Assamese nationality in moment of post-colonial nation-making process. The paper examined the role of the regional ethnic identity-based political mobilization, which sought to undo economic and political injustices resulting from new nation-state making process. The paper argued that such popular protests led by educated class, their bargains with the nation-state led to constant interpretation of citizenship laws and gave birth to distinct popular political history of citizenship in Assam. It also reinstated state's position. Assam, though, through a long bargain with the center and through instances of critical stance towards federal structure of India, validated her unique case, redefined the idea of citizenship by successfully tangling the question of nationality and reform the center-state political dynamics in the process. Thank you very much. It's a privilege to start and end the session. Thank you.
Thank you.
I invite Rashmi to begin with her comments.
Thank you, Rohit. I have written comments, so what I'm going to do is maybe start and only speak on the first two papers to begin with, to take us into the discussion, and then maybe you can come in and then we can resume the discussion. So first of all, thanks very much to the organizers for inviting me. It's a privilege to hear these excellent papers and be here. I am interloping from political science, so please forgive me for not getting some of the historical nuances of some of the debates, but I'll try my best. First, with the Assam paper, so Ms. Saikia's paper took us into an historical dive into the antecedents of the Assamese movement and its contest with the Indian state to autonomously define its boundaries of citizenship and belonging. The state of Assam has long been in contest with the center of over the migrant indigene dividing line in the state. And there's been a significant disquiet the state has seen over the citizen foreigner categories, which has now been exacerbated with the fallout of the NRC. So I think it would be best to say the situation has not had any clear closures so far politically. The paper gives us an account of the regional imaginations that the Assamese nationalists put forth to safeguard their anxieties over maintaining their separate cultural identities. These arguments have been predicated on the desire to to protect the distinct language, culture, and local economy from the waves of migration of refugees and settlers from bordering states in the state of Assam. Assam has also historically resisted first the colonial state and then the central Indian government's attempts to be seen as a peripheral place with no people, and in the process giving us an alternative proposal around regional federations, which the paper has helpfully illustrated for us today. At the same time, the paper lists the various proposals and conceptual interjections by the Assamese intelligentsia to propose measures such as dual citizenship to stem the demographic changes they perceive as threatening. The reality is arguably quite contested and much more unstable than these forceful pushes of creating a homogenizing regional identity would let us believe. Successful exercises at adjudicating the boundaries of citizenship have proved to us that the political and legal crisis emanating from the difficulty of assigning specific cutoff dates and the expectation of what some consider to be an impersonal legal process cannot be simply mechanistic, and is riddled with problem that turns citizens and what Sanjeev Barua has called suffraged non-citizens into overnight phantoms. In the contemporary scenario in the state, this is further complicated by the Hinduization of Assamese politics, which has introduced a further divisive strain into these historical processes of assimilation and the difficulties of coexistence. Given this distance that has now been traveled in Assamese politics, I would like to ask the presenter, how do these elucidations of the vernacular imaginations of little nationalism remain mindful of their territorial and ethnic insulations? While there is no doubt that the changes of these migration on Assamese society have been tremendous, can it be said that the erstwhile fears of a loss of identity have not proven to be as damaging as initially perceived? And the struggle is also a moral and ethical one besides being territorial and political. Here, I would like to draw your attention to what Yasmin Saikia has argued for, which is a melange of identities that is continuously blending, where the meaning of being Assamese has continuously shifted. In this process, Yasmin Saikia has argued, Assam has produced a crossroads culture, which she argues involves a diffusion of practices sourced from multiple locations that were absorbed into people's lives, which is different from both hybridity or syncretism, but it has been an elastic process that has defined Assamese history. It would be great if the presenter engaged with these new imaginations, which perhaps provide us a way out of the state nationality question and the erstwhile dominant framings that we saw, which is go beyond the ethno-nationalist concerns of the last few decades and perhaps imagine a different kind of future. In the second paper on Goa, we find another federal case for a unique state and its contest over rightful belonging. The paper offers to us a historical overview of the contested idea of a Goan identity, first stamped by the long authoritarian rule of the Portuguese and the feudal exploitation, and then the protracted agitations in independent Goa around the rightful place of Marathi and subsequently of Konkani. Building through a historical explanation through various material and identitarian stakes at work, we realize the difficulties of proceeding to a stable, common perception of statehood at work through Mr. Naik's paper, which destabilizes the received narrative around the natural identity of the Goan state. Through this account of this impossible merger, the paper offers plausible reasons for this arrested history by locating the alternate identities at work of longing, particularly of the Bahujan Samaj and its leaning towards merger with Maharashtra. By locating this longing and its expression in spaces such as the local theatre, the paper offers a tantalizing possibility of reading these expressions through what Sharmila Rege has elsewhere called the construction of a counter-public that works through alternate institutional dissemination and modes of communication towards consolidation of alternative possibilities, in this case towards the assertion of Maratha identity. However, we should also remind ourselves that the possibilities of linguistic and regional statehood have always been tenuous possibilities. And as the case of, say, Andhra Pradesh and its quest for independent statehood has shown us, there was never any inherent or natural community based on language that would lead to a political community. These imaginations are made and remade within the political possibilities that are present. I take the Andhra statehood question because as a comparative example, because the Ardra activists, for instance, were working on developing a constituency for their demands. They were constantly stressing their regional needs and making a continuous case for a homogeneous identity. In Goa's case, while we understand that these fissures have always existed in the projected cohesive identity of statehood, it would be great to see how this question is this a question of interpretation, because there was an equally powerful, as your paper has shown us, there was an equally powerful United Goa movement against the merger towards Maharashtra, or is this a case where other political identities had more political success in comparison? So we get a material understanding of the missed aspirations of the Bahujan Samaj, but not a complete understanding of how these imaginations get written off, mobilized, or immobilized. Second, since the presenter described this section as the Bahujan Samaj, and I think you've spoken about this in the presentation, it would be helpful to know how this identity came about and became politically viable. And if this is the plank on which the MJP fought the elections, then why was it reluctant in its four-stated aims of actually merging with Maharashtra? So that puzzle was not very clear to me. Thank you very much. I think I'll leave it here, and then maybe I'll come back to the other two papers.
Rashmi, I just got a message from Rohit saying that it might be better to do all the comments right now and then just leave it for questions.
Sure. Okay. I'll try to be more brief. Ardra's paper on communicating Marxism to the masses, or the ghosts of communist past, and the history of socialist realism, gave us an interesting account of how these attempts at forging a new public consciousness played out in Kerala. Here, culture becomes an important instrument of this new consciousness, but it also becomes secondary to political ends as attempts to confine it to the narrow framework of communist modernity take root. In this project, there are both vernacular and cosmopolitan elements, and there's a complex process by which this new imaginary process plays itself into popular understanding. The presenter leaves us with an open possibility, describing the contradictions of the project, but I personally would like to know more about what she calls as the rupture between life and progress. What does that entail, and what are its contours? Since the conference is also about this subject, it would be worthwhile perhaps to pursue what became canonical and what became political as these movements progressed in the background of significant cultural and political change. And relatedly, what was kept and what was discarded in the process? How did this relationship change with the breakaway of radical writers and thinkers from the Communist Party? The second question I had is something Ardra has already addressed. So I was referring to what some of these attempts, I think Nissim Manutukaren has called these the refurbished caste elitism of the communist writers in the way that it has, shown itself again in this process. And my second and related question was about the missing question of feminism and gender. So I think you can come back to that. The last paper, which is on the POSCO Prathirodh Sangram Samiti, Menon's paper gave us a narrative on the waxing and waning of the struggle against exclusionary development. They gave us an account of the movement's inception, development, and eventual disillusionment. She punctuated the narrative by describing the exigencies of politics and the inconsistent stance of the government towards the Forest Rights Act. The paper focuses on issues related to movement framing, organization, distance between ideologues and participants, and tries to understand what drives organizational momentum. It would be helpful here to be perhaps careful about assuming ideological uniformity. As social movement studies have argued, the assumption of a shared identity and shared grievances tends to dominate movement studies. But the reality is, of course, far more complicated, and movements have contrasting subjectivities and diverse factions and interests at play. And I think that came out quite well in your presentation. The second thing that the paper focuses on is the issue of transparency. Here, I think Rakare and Mary Katzenstein's work offers a related question on the representational quotient of social movements in India. And they ask, and I quote, whether movement activism has served the constituencies of the least advantage that movements in India have so strongly over the years claimed to represent. In this light, it would be helpful to think about what Ghanshyam Shah has tried to classify as different transformative potentials of social movements. So in his category, there was the rebel and the revolt and the revolution and so on. Social movements are dynamic, and their subject actors shift over time, especially in the context of, say, SEZs and the unleashing of market forces. Movement actors face new constraints, challenges, and possibilities. In the contemporary context, movement also faces front crunches, and movement survival becomes very difficult. So in this background, my question is, what do these corruption allegations, and I think it's not very important whether they get proved or not, but rather what do they signify in the grid of state capital and corporations? Related to this is the question is this simply corruption, or are these backhanded contracts, illegal pilferage of the state resources, something more than corruption? And what do they tell us about the nature of Indian economy and the Indian state? I'm thinking of recent work on criminal political economies of India, which is a recent book by Barbara Harris-White and others, where they ask if the new type of developments are the neoliberal economy, or are they just simply an approximation of the neoliberal economy, because they remain dominated by informal bargains, by private groups, by corporations, different kinds of mafia, and with both dynastic and oligarchic elements, in the state and in the capital relations. But I greatly enjoyed this panel, so thank you very much. I'm going to end there, and sorry if I took too much time.
Thank you so much, Rashmi. I'm going to be very brief and maybe just highlight two questions that run through all the papers, and the speakers can choose to reflect on them or not. That's entirely up to them. And I was thinking about the larger goal behind the workshop, which is to think about new political intellectual histories of South Asia and what they need to engage with. The first, and I think that's in the design of the panel itself, is really almost all the papers looked at ways in which regions were re-articulating their relationship with the imagined center or the imagined nation, post-colonial nation state. However, when we study regional movements, there is in some ways a kind of naturalness given to the region. And I was wondering, for those of you who have the time, to perhaps reflect on that it was not inevitable that this be the particular kind of political identity. And I think it comes across very clearly in Kaustubh's presentation, because there is actually a choice given to the region as to whether they want to maintain a separate identity or not. But in the case of Kerala in the 30s, the kind of imagination of the Kerala communists is very different from once the territorialization of Kerala happens in the 1950s. In Meena's case, it is framed as a paper about Odisha, but it's really a story about a certain kind of ecological resource zone that applies in many different parts of India. But Odisha becomes the field of politics, given the kind of ways in which state laws, etc., are organized. My second comment was to sort of pick up on a term that Prarthana's actors used, which is jati, which in the case of Assam seems to stand in for a ethnic identity. But when we look at, sort of, say, Kaustubh's paper, it's quite clear that jati breaks down into a caste linguistic identity. And in Ardra's paper, I thought there was a very interesting tension between a kind of progressive, transformative idea of aesthetics and what you mentioned a few times, also the certain kind of caste culture which was dominant in the Communist Party at that time. So when we think about terms that actors use and how they're translated, perhaps just a reflection on what work that specific term does in your paper. So I think we have just maybe a round of responses from all the speakers. You can go in the order that we started.
Prarthana?
Yeah, okay. So I'll respond to Rashmi first. So when you talk about the ethnic identity in Assam, I understand it's a very problematic to define the Assamese in the present context. But I was actually, in the paper, I was trying to draw attention to the very idea of how the Assamese middle class, through a very strong literary tradition, initiated the process of proper, make a proper case of Assam within the legal framework of citizenship. So that's why it was not within the scope of the paper that I could discuss all the ethnic identity based movements in Assam. But yes, I'm aware that there are a lot of there are different parallel movements like the Boro movement, NDFB movement, and BLT movement, but which actually they were like during 1980s. they formed the movement, their movement became very strong, which was after the Assam movement. And that is also very significant that after the Assamese nationalists, led by the educated Assamese middle class, after they kind of, entangle the question of nationality within the legal framework of citizenship, these ethnic groups, they started negotiating with the state in a way, to get the autonomy or other kind of privileges within the nation state. So I understand this is a very, very difficult situation, but I think that keeping the aim of the paper, that's why I just, ignore that part. And coming to Rohit's observation, the jati, I think jati, particularly in Assamese, it's a dictionary meaning that we do not have word for caste. In Assamese, jati means caste and jati means nation. So, that's why while I was referring to the vernacular text, then when he meant jati, when Ambikagiri Roy Chaudhuri used the term jati, he meant the nation. He did not mean caste. And the caste system in Assam is very, very difficult. It's very, very different from any other regions of India. It is there, but it is invisible. So mostly, even in a religious, cultural background also, sometimes the jati word is used to refer to different people from different religion, people from different caste, but mostly jati means nation in Assam. So maybe it's because of lack of word that when I discussed with the scholars, then it was because of lack of word. Maybe it is used that way. So thanks. Did I answer all the questions? Hopefully, yeah. Thank you.
Hi. I think to respond to Dr. Rashmi's second sort of proposition, I think I skipped that section where I talk about, this has been largely recorded that Bandodkar was, the first chief minister was slightly reluctant on the merger, but the public demand for it was quite strong. And after the opinion poll sort of did not turn in favor, and even the promise to merge was within the first year. Was one of the chief demands, but it took till 67 because he kept on postponing that sort of. Because there are other forces at play. Bandodkar himself was quite embroiled into the state. He was a miner himself. So there are other ways in which recently I was told that the way mining leases sort of work in Goa are very different from the rest of the country. So a lot of this politics, which has the veneer of linguistic identity and cultural regionalism, is actually has to do with a lot of legal and land ownership frameworks that are put in place by the Portuguese state. So yeah, and it's only now that I'm sort of looking at them in detail, because I was initially looking only at my MPhil was around only was only around theatre, Marathi theatre in Goa, and looking at how that sort of anchors into a certain genealogy of Marathi identity in Goa. But I think that's a great suggestion that probably in my broader work I will sort of What was your first sort of question? I think I missed out on that.
I think I can email that to you later on, but I think Rohit has told us that we need to wind up very quickly, so maybe we'll
sure. Yeah. Thank you. Again, to responding to Professor Day's sort of, the region is always, it's, if you see in Goa, it's all, it's a very contested, formulation. Even in the form in which Goa gets colonized, for example, it's only the coastal part that is sort of colonized for first 200 years, and you have the hinterland coming much later in the colonial period. So what we think of Goa and how that sort of changes the demographic is also, it's a very contested identity, and perhaps we need let's say more nuanced conceptual and historical sort of work to sort of get a certain sense of stability in this formulation. I think the the one thing that I wanted to probably say is, I mean, Goa is an interesting case in the sense that it was integrated in the Indian Union after the first phase of linguistic reorganization was complete. So, in that sense, linguistic identity as a precondition to statehood was something, a vocabulary that was already set by the time Goa even comes into the Indian Union. And so what actually, and why Goa also becomes interesting, because I think I don't know, I've not checked with like other, I mean, whatever I've checked, Goa perhaps is the only linguistic state that retains its colonial boundaries. If you see all other sort of states, you have sort of all Marathi speaking region gets, some of it goes to Gujarat, some of it goes to Madhya Pradesh, a large chunk of it stays in Maharashtra. But Goa, it does not happen. So what is happening here is the dominant caste is sort of retrofitting the Goan region into a certain linguistic identity formulation. And I think that is something that has interested me, is that, how a region that was merely, limited by a certain colonial boundary now has to reinvent itself as a region that retains its what do you say, the specificity of its legal, its land ownership patterns and stuff, and at the same time be integrated into the Indian Union. And I think there is, I mean, you can refer to Raghu Trichu's work, who argues how actually Goa is integrated in the Indian Union by producing it as a different region. So that's a very interesting argument that he makes, but I'll just stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Rashmi, for this wonderful comments, and thank you, Professor Day, for the observations. I just want to briefly mention how life and progress kind of parted ways soon after this period that I mentioned. On the one hand, some of the writers who were not part of the communist movement have mentioned how the communist movement couldn't actually handle the excesses and the possibilities that life as a concept offered, and it wanted to limit itself to a certain political subjectivities and propagating a certain lifestyle, certain characters, with a peculiar understanding of labor, the laboring class, laboring body, and the kind of moral and aesthetic structures these characters were supposed to follow. So mostly the yardstick became a kind of the yardstick of moral progress of a society. And one of the curious examples was that of matrilini, because very soon after matrilini was legally, abolished in Kerala, it became a very bad thing to even talk about. There are several explorations into this, absence of, like the destruction of matrilini and suddenly the coming of the father figure. And so that kind of, what I meant was, it couldn't take the possibilities that life as a category could offer. So it had to keep a lot of revolutionary and actually radical writers outside of its canon. And the division was very clear even up to the 1980s, and where the dominant critical aesthetic mechanism was, driven by Marxist ideology. Most of the critiques in Kerala came later in the 1990s. Till then, to the late 80s, it was a very dominant, aesthetic criticism. Marxism was the dominant mode of critique. So I think it's 2 minutes already, so maybe we could sometime take up the discussion later, I hope. Thank you, Professor Day, especially, and thank you, Rashmi. Thanks, all of you.
Yeah, thanks, Rashmi. Those were very good observations. And yes, I am familiar with Ghanshyam Shah's categorization of movements, but I would be happy if you could email your comments so I could just really go over them properly. I will quickly respond to the two questions in the box, if that's okay. One is about the Maoist tag to the movement. Yes, I think that's a very deliberate attempt, not only in this movement, but in other movements as well, including against Vedanta and Niyamgiri, where people are now being accused of being Maoist and randomly arrested and jailed for no reason. So I think also partly the violence that was engineered in the anti-POSCO movement was kind of paved the way for that, to call it Maoist, to say that there were Maoist elements. They could have been, and they could not have been, but there were a lot of Marxist Leninist groups, some of them involved. In fact, many of the people left the CPI in the course of this movement and joined the Marxist Leninist groups, which is kind of working back to what Rashmi was saying about different players. And yes, Vibhuta was arrested. So you see, he contested the election with the help of the BJD, and that's another nest of corruption. So I don't know. It's not. Yeah, it is the legacy media which has been spinning this corruption story. In fact, confronting the PPSS, saying you are funded by the Tatars. In fact, that's what most people told me. They said that this is a movement funded by the Tatars. So I have no proof of all this, and as Rashmi rightly pointed out, even if there's no proof, there is a kind of shadow of this kind of corruption which needs to be discussed, not as, oh, did they really get the money or not, but in a different political and social context. The other question relates to corruption as a tool to mark credibility. Unfortunately, it did gain attention in my case study, and I had absolutely no intentions of looking at corruption. So it kind of crept in, and I felt it was too big a point to be ignored. But obviously, that's not going to be the only point I'm looking at. And as I said, I plan to put it in a, contextualize it in a proper way, so that there is a kind of understanding that is not finger pointing, but also trying to understand why this corruption is used as a tool to mark credibility. I'm not so sure about that. But then there is a whole debate that I cannot ignore. I hope this answers your question. I just want to quickly say thank you to Rohit Dey, to Rashmi, to all the participants, and especially to the Rohit from Cambridge for organizing this and for giving me this opportunity. Thank you so much.
Thank you. So we won't have time for niceties. Thank you, Professor. Thank you, Dr. Dey. Thank you, Rashmi, and thank you all the panelists. We are completely out of time. Let's hope we meet again in some other panel.